There's something disastrous going on in South Korea that can only be described as the most dramatic birth rate decline ever recorded in human history. South Korea's fertility rate, that being the average number of births per woman, has fallen once again to a record low 0.68, which is by far the lowest anywhere in the entire world. For reference, South Korea lags far behind even China, whose fertility rate has been rapidly declining ever since its infamous one-child policy was established. In the absence of immigration, the fertility rate needed to maintain a country's population must be at least 2.1, but the levels seen in South Korea are obviously much lower and have been for a while. Some experts have even gone as far to say that the country's current population of 51 million may even halve to a measly 26 million by 2100 if the trends are not immediately reversed. The dramatic fall in fertility rates has been declared a national emergency in South Korea, and the problem's gotten so bad that the country's military has had to downsize, despite escalating tensions with North Korea. But South Korea's demographic crisis is hardly a new story, and it's one of many countries across East Asia that's been trying to encourage its population to have more children. South Korea's had a fertility rate below 2.1 since the early 80s, and below 1 since 2018. But the severity of this decline in birth rate is unprecedented, and the fact that it's continued to fall despite already being a historic low should leave alarm bells ringing for any developed country struggling with the same problem. So why exactly is this happening, and what can be done about it? The problem's multifaceted, but there are two main concerns that stand out. The first being the growing gender divide in South Korea, and the second being unaffordable cost of living. We'll start with the gender divide. Recent statistics show that, as is the case in most developed countries, young women between the ages of 18 and 29 are becoming more politically liberal, whilst young men in the same age range are becoming more conservative. South Korea is by far the most extreme example of this. Young Korean men are generally quite traditional, and unlike in Europe and the West, it's not an uncommon view among Korean men that women should focus more on their families and less on their careers. The problem is that South Korea has one of the most demanding working environments anywhere in the world, with one of the longest work weeks of all the developed nations making up the OECD. Many Koreans feel that there's little to no support for work-life balance, meaning there simply isn't enough time to raise a family. And given that wages have failed to catch up with the inflated cost of living and additional costs for education, there isn't enough money either. And the situation's even worse for women. The gender pay gap in South Korea is by far the highest in the OECD, where salaries are on average a third lower for women compared to men. And considering the hyper-competitive work culture, many Korean women worry that taking maternity leave will hurt their career progression. For many, sacrificing a career to raise a family just isn't worth it. Despite all this, voting behaviour seems to suggest that South Korean millennials and Gen Z are becoming more conservative than older generations. In the country's 2022 presidential election, young men swung heavily behind the right-wing People Power Party and its leader Yoon Suk-yeol, who recently pledged to increase the work week from 52 hours to a maximum of 69 hours, and despite backlash even promised to abolish the country's gender equality ministry. Young women, meanwhile, heavily backed the Liberal Democratic Party in almost equal and opposite numbers. In general, the widening ideological gap has strained gender relations in South Korea and shows what can happen when men and women part ways. It's at least partly because of this that the country's marriage rate has plummeted, which is down a whopping 40% from a decade ago. Fewer marriages obviously mean fewer children, especially since having children out of wedlock is heavily frowned upon in South Korea. But let's say that you are happily married and are looking to have children. Chances are you'll also want a decent place to live. Unluckily for many Koreans, there also isn't really enough housing to go around, and real estate in Seoul happens to be some of the most expensive anywhere in the world. With high housing costs obviously come high mortgage costs, which explains why levels of household debt in South Korea are also some of the highest in the developed world. Unaffordable housing and rising mortgages of course mean that young Koreans are often discouraged from starting families. You might find this a little surprising. After all, the expectation was that because South Korea's population is already in decline, there'd be less demand for housing, and in turn prices would drop. Unfortunately for many young Koreans, this hasn't really happened at all, because what the economists didn't see coming was the explosive rise in single-person households, which quickly outpaced housing growth in and around Seoul. So getting onto the property ladder in 2024 is becoming near impossible. What doesn't help is that basically everybody wants to live in Seoul, and that's hardly surprising considering that it's where all the jobs are. But it's not exactly ideal for real estate. The city dominates everything from Korean politics to its economy, Adding in all its satellite cities, the Seoul metropolitan area is one of the largest in the entire world, and accounts for over half of the country's entire population. There really isn't any other place on Earth quite like it. The only other place being somewhat comparable is Tokyo. And even considering Tokyo's significantly higher population, the population of Japan as a whole is also much higher. Nevertheless, rapid urbanization tends to result in lower fertility rates. And given that just over half of South Korea's entire population lives in high-rises, it's no surprise that the country has been hit especially hard, despite other East Asian countries also having the same issues. So with all that said, where does South Korea go from here? Well, according to current data, the government has spent the equivalent of $200 billion into programs to support new mothers in the last 16 years alone, only to watch the fertility rate continue to sink in the same time span. The problem is so difficult to fix because it's ingrained in the country's culture. It will take a long time to change, and it may mean that successive governments may have to switch to a more liberal stance on work, despite the economic problems that come with it. It's also been suggested that advancements in AI may also have a role in reducing the cost of private education, called hagwon, which is too much to commit to for most Korean parents. But the only real way for South Korea to turn this around is to rely heavily on immigration. It's been a notoriously difficult country to get into, and the only path for becoming a citizen or permanent resident is to marry a South Korean. But for immigration to offset the country's declining birth rate, it would need to see an influx of roughly 10 times as many foreign workers as there are today. And that in and of itself brings with it its own set of problems. Without it, however, South Korea's destiny will continue to see a dwindling population year after year, until it ultimately becomes the oldest country in the world. I hope you managed to learn a thing or two from this video. A lot of effort goes into making them, and if you haven't yet subscribed, now would be a good time to do so. Don't forget to also hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any future content. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.